I remember, at least I believe I do, my first battle. It is not a pleasant memory, in fact, it's not a memory that I should even have. The chains that bind me divide my thoughts, but they are crude, trusting to brute strength what skill could do so much easier, and pieces occasionally slip through. These slivers of sensory data stab into my mind, maddeningly incomplete and fading away before I can latch onto them, before I can fully understand them. Scraps, names, images, sensations. Nothing I can understand, except one moment. Jagged and raw, it worries at the periphery of my mind, its edges cutting into my thoughts. That is what I remember most from my first battle. The screaming. Bright and clear. So loud that I can taste it. So loud that if I listen to it, I can no longer think. All I can hear is it, all I know is what happens next. The chains come next, binding and choking me, dragging me back to the here and now, but for precious, terrible instants I dream. And I remember. That should not happen. Other parts come and go, but this is what I always remember, how it feels to die. Alert 5 Station Master slid down the ladder to the listening post's cramped command deck. Status, the young man ordered as he tugged the last few buttons on his uniform into place. He'd been roused from a sound sleep, but even an officer as young as he had learned that bad news never waited for your convenience. Another probe compact ships had been jumping in and out system for a handful of days. This wasn't just the usual pattern, they were preparing for something. Alert 5 Sensor Mistress shook her head, her crests flat against her head and neck. No, Master. It's not. The Station Master, it was a traditional title, just as the commander of a vessel was always a ship master, regardless of their actual rank, leaned over his subordinate's display. Gods below, he whispered. Threat icons were appearing on the display. 4. 7. 15. More. 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 This wasn't a lone scout testing their responses or a probe pecking away at Yoltik's defenses. This was an invasion. They couldn't hope to hold Yoltik down. Not an invasion. A siege. A system kill. The young man looked up at his comm specialist, his expression drawn. Alert the inner system. He leaned further over the sensor mistress's shoulder as he studied the display. The compact force was reverting in tight formation. The bastards had a gift for synchronized emergence, but their formation was too tight. There was something in there that they didn't want anyone to see. The station master closed his inner eyelids as he addressed his sensor mistress. Once the enemy force finishes reversion, switch to active sensing. Pull everything we can from them and send it to fleet control. Ailish, that will. I know, Tresha. The station master squeezed the young woman's shoulder. But they're trying to hide something. We have to know what. We have to let Dawn know. Tresha nodded. Emergence is almost complete, she said quietly. She looked up at her superior. He put his hand over hers, meeting the gaze of his comtech. She nodded, and together, the station master and his sensor operator brought Alert 5 scanners to active status. It took less than a minute for the listening post sensors to burn through the compact jamming. Before they had even done so, tracer missiles were inbound. Shadows below, Ailish heard Tresha whisper. It's a chariot. They brought a chariot. She looked to him, her facial scales fading to white. Ailish pursed his lips. He knew what that meant as well as she did. Then let the gods favor our guns, he said, his eyes intent on the display, watching as the tracers came closer. Echo cocked her head as the Sentinel station vanished in a pattering of radiation bursts, thermal flares, and flashes of light. Overkill, a single beam rider would have destroyed the listening post. For herself, she would have preferred to send in a single steel-fed interceptor and kill the station quietly, dropping the task force deeper in system. Still, Rena's strategy appeared sound, if seemingly uninspired, a single mailed first directed at the heart of the Iskanjay defenses, trusting to sheer brute strength over maneuver and strategy. Appearances, Echo mused, curling a forelock of dark hair around her finger. They lie. Her lips twitched up in a small little grin and she ran her tongue over her teeth. They lie indeed. Pushing the amusement at her private little joke, the emissary turned her attention back to Black Arrow's tactical plot, her eyes darting from icon to icon, drinking in every bit of information. It wasn't enough, wasn't fast enough. Wasn't anything enough for her. She wanted, needed, craved more. And this was what she had. She forced the resentment from her mind for the moment, returning to her considerations of the tactical situation. A cursory observation would have made one wonder if the Bastion leader's reputation was exaggerated. As it was, Echo was enjoying the spectacle, the breaths she didn't need catching in her throat as she waited for the next note in the symphony. Her fingers moved in time to a melody that no one else heard and she closed her eyes for the briefest of moments, wishing that she could hear the sound of running water. It was a widely accepted fact that the compact of species, despite whatever philosophical disagreements, territorial conflicts, trade arguments, and political differences that it had with every other nation in the galaxy, were the preeminent shipbuilders. Their material science was generations ahead of even their Iskanjay rivals, their screens stronger, their acceleration curves sharper. Internal systems were heavily protected and multiple redundancies prevented easy light switch kills. On average, a compact vessel of any given class had to sustain penetrating damage on over 30% of its surface before core system functions were compromised and it could remain combat capable up until it was barely recognizable as a starship. Compact ships could withstand damage that would cripple virtually any other vessel of a similar class and remain combat capable. Less advanced civilizations often struggled to kill even the lightest compact vessels. The durability of their warships made compact commanders much more aggressive than the captains of other nations. A compact officer could commit their vessels to actions that would see virtually any other equivalent starship destroyed and not only survive, but emerge victorious. As compact ships were both more maneuverable and possessed higher accelerations than many competing ship classes, it was rare that the compact did not dictate the flow of battle. In turn, this aggression led to very straightforward tactics, the compact's technical superiority ossifying these attributes. A noted compact flag officer was once quoted as saying, "Battles of maneuver are for those who can only run." None of this changed the fact that the Iskanjay Principality was the compact's deadliest enemy. More than 500 ships stood between Bastion leader Rena's fleet and the command nexus itself, and if each of them was inferior to a comparable vessel from the Space Force, it was not such a degree of inferiority that an easy victory was assured. Principality ships had superior command and control facilities, improved data links, and all the other benefits that went with their advanced electronics. This allowed Iskanjay fleets to react far faster than a compact battle force, giving them at least one advantage on the battlefield. Seated in his command throne, Rena had his fingers laced together, his attention fixed to the main tactical plot. The Jackal commander's response was prompt, he would give him that much. Already, the local picket forces were falling back with a telltale alacrity, boosting towards the nearest citadel. The listening post had pierced his deception after all. Most annoying, but he had never truly expected it to survive the first exchange of fire. In order to bring their chariot further in system before detection, some more callous officers might have even refused to contribute to the Armada's defense, allowing their fleets to take the brunt of the first few salvos, to prevent the Escangay from confirming their presence. Renaud was not that type of commander. At least, he hoped that he wasn't. Notify Squadron Turak to disperse further, he ordered. Another 2 million kilometers per craft. It was an understandable mistake. Principality missiles had weaker warheads but slightly longer range than his own. They also did love their railguns, their annoying proficient computer networks allowing them to be used at ranges compact commanders could only dream of. Turak's positioning was optimal for mutual support from missiles and rail fire. But not against a sudden massed charge. The jackals loved playing in the libration points, yes they did. The Escangay were tricky warriors. None of their mongrel races had the liver for a pure battle, but they more than made up for that with cleverness. He'd seen it before, a formation advancing on a principality position, their screens set forward to endure both missiles and rail fire being caught by surprise as the devious jackals shocked right on top of them, using an in-system libration point to launch the sally. The formation fell apart as the Principality ships charged into the compact's midst, a suicide run on the command vessel and its deputies. Thrown into disarray, the formation was then easily destroyed by the surviving jackal forces. Yes, he had seen it happen. The bastion leader absently touched a hand to the left breast of his uniform, just above where a piece of shrapnel had cut into him. Renaud gestured and the display shifted, providing a readout on the forces arrayed against him. Too much of the data was incomplete or painted in by the ship's analysts and logic engines. He knew some details and suspected others, but he would have preferred to know more of the composition of the defenders. As every leader in every battle has ever wished, he remonstrated himself with a mental chuckle. Still, it bothered him that he had had no time for proper reconnaissance, even if he could have been assured that his scouts would not be detected. As the Principality were not idiots, prolonged scouting would have them bolstering their defenses and making an operation that already had a high likelihood of failure an outright impossibility. Many of Renaud's subordinate leaders would revel in the glory of this battle, their hunger for renown sated by this valiant strike against the simpering Principality, or however the reels would spin it. There would be toasts raised to every enemy ship destroyed, tales spun of valor and claims of whipping the Escangay into their kennels. He cared nothing for any of it. This battle served the compact only in the data his teams could take from the Jackal's databanks. Anything he destroyed would be rebuilt before the rest of the crusading fleets could ever take advantage of it, and if he dared linger in system, the Jackals would call in every flotilla in the area to defend their festering hive. He would let his officers chatter in the aftermath. For him the only value was in finding information that could lay bare whatever the wound was planning and to remember the sacrifice of every soldier he had committed to death this day. The bastion leader leaned forward, his eyes watching the swift, unhurried shift in the defenders' lines, and prepared himself for the butcher's tally to come. Located at a nexus of stable shock routes, Yultuk Dawn was the linchpin upon which hundreds of worlds depended, a command nexus for 36 sectors, controlling the deployment and operations of nearly 7,000 ships and 300 inhabited 100-star systems of various sizes and values. A massive fleet yard complex, capable of building and servicing nearly 1,000 hulls at any given moment, squatted deep in system, hundreds of kilometers of ship wombs. Smaller shipyards were scattered throughout the system. These were tasked for both the construction of non-military hulls and the outfitting and repair of civilian ships. Other yards were owned by various corporations to service their own massive fleets, courier services, mining concerns, or shipping companies who moved untold trillions of tons of material across space. A never-ending flow of these ships came to pay tribute to the hunger of Yultuk Dawn's yards, drifting processing centers and refineries converting raw materials into the bones and organs of newborn starships. 3 billion sentients from all the races of the principality called Yoltic Dawn home, from the officers and non-coms stationed here, to the work crews who built and maintained the vast installations and the service personnel, restaurateurs, shop owners, shipping magnates, and entertainers who tended to the needs and wants of the military and corporate personnel. It was not an easy target, nor would it be any commander's first choice of targets. 5 rings of orbital fortresses, palisades to the Escanje, ran throughout the orbital paths of the system's 12 planets, who were themselves garrisoned by additional palisades, platforms, and minefields. 500 warships served as a permanent garrison. The Yoltic home fleet comprised of squadrons of light escorts all the way up 3 battleship regiments and a full supercarrier wing, and there were another 100 warships present for retrofitting, personnel and cargo transfers, convoy escort, and other assorted duties. Deep in Principality territory, Yoltic Dawn's overseers had never envisioned their enemy being so bold, nor that they would bring one of their god ships this deep into their borders. Execution Force Rana emerged on the fringes of the star system, 100 ships ripping their way into space, swift destroyers and scouting cruisers lunging ahead of the massive battle cruisers and battleships that surrounded the Goliath at the heart of their formation. Those 100 ships might exact a heavy toll before being destroyed, but they were so badly outnumbered that the Principality would prevail. All they could do was withdraw before the Escanje fleet reached them. The presence of the chariot changed that equation considerably. Only the heaviest palisades had the firepower to kill such a beast. If it were allowed to rampage unchecked, millions would die and Yoltic Dawn would suffer greatly. It had to die. Above all else, that ship must be destroyed. Further in system, the larger ships of the Yoltic home fleet roused themselves to full readiness. They had been prepared for this moment and they would engage, but not in time to save their pickets. The defenders of the outer perimeter were already dead. The instant Rana's command shocked in system, bludgeoning towards the densest knot of civilian traffic, they'd known that they were going to die. Their lives would be traded in slowing the compact armada, buying time for the evacuation of the freighters and commerce posts. System Command directed a demand for the compact ships to leave the system immediately or face destruction, although no one expected them to heed it. Group leader Disran and 5 names besides struggled not to snap at the human as it wandered around his bridge, like a particularly ugly lost child. He knew it was a Triarch's chosen emissary, but that made its presence here merely tolerable. He had heard whispers from his crew about this thing, that it was diseased. Not in the normal way, although Disran knew lesser species and humans in particular to be unclean. There was something wrong with its mind, a sickness that should have brought it to the attention of the confessors and social workers. Instead of the corrective surgery or psychological conditioning that such faults should have engendered, somehow this animal had come to the attention of a Triarch itself. He felt an unpleasant sensation run up his spine as he regarded the misshapen little beast. He had heard enough about humans to know that they were not merely the unintelligent apes that they appeared to be. They had challenged the compact, spurred by some madness to hurl themselves at a foe that they could not hope to defeat. Disran had heard the most unpleasant rumors, stories of humans eating the dead, of burning their own cities just to get at compact forces, of their ships lying amidst the dead to ambush the navy or falling upon helpless freighters and wapists with berserker savagery. Madness. Infectious, incurable madness across an entire species. Disran watched the sow's fingers twitch spastically and tried not to think more on it. He was about to snap at the human to remain still when she froze, her attention fixed to the tactical board. She didn't even seem to be breathing. "And so," she whispered suddenly. "And so it goes." She lifted her head to look at Disran. Her eyes glinted with an unhealthy light and her face was flushed. "Can you hear it? Hear what the Tribune snapped?" She turned away, as if she'd lost interest in him. "The music." Her smile widened. It started to rain. In the darkness of its tower, the Triarch looked upon the gleaming stars that surrounded its throne. Pale lips drew back from a mouthful of needle teeth in a smile that split its face, its skeletally thin fingers laced together as it waited. "Set all screens forward," Sigil Leader Aulia ordered, the thoughtful barely glancing at Renat, the Bastion leader's attention fixed to the master plot. Millions of kilometers away, the first deadline waited, a jackal citadel. A minor one only, there to convince Unbound of the error of seeking prey among Yultik's many fat merchantmen. Almost 30 Askanjay escorts of varying weights lay between the citadel's gates and the compact force, screening the transports as they struggled to embark their crews and flee. Their destruction was of no consequence to him, but the loss of so much raw material, so many ships. It would weaken the principality in this region. Not to any real extent, but it would take that much longer to ship its goods, cost that much more. Another small cut that the principality must tend to. Besides, it was what he would be expected to do if his goal was truly to assault the system in earnest. The Tribune's eyes were intent on the display and he felt the smallest of smiles tug at his lips as he noted the pattern to the jackal's formation. He lifted his gaze and regarded Aulia. Her lipless mouth was an echo of Renat's own small self-indulgent amusement. "We are here to conquer and destroy, are we not?" "Yes, we are." Squadron Master Kesh of the Destroyer Blood of Majesties chewed his lip thoughtfully as he sat in his command chair, watching the oncoming tide of metal. Like anyone else, the Askanjadazet would prefer not to die, but there were over 4 dozen transports and civilian craft berthed at this palisade station. Tens of thousands of lives hung in the balance. He wouldn't, abandon them. The enemy was without concept of mercy, their divine right to rule granting them absolution from any sin committed in the name of peace. Their peace. "Do we have shooting solutions?" he asked in calmly, as he had every other time. Gleaming eyes at dusk, the ship's second mistress, bobbed her head in the negative, and annoyed his slithering through her teeth. Her irritation was not directed at him, but towards the compact who had learned a few new tricks in how to shroud their vessels. "Not yet," she said. "They're still too far out." The end of her tail twitched. Save for Kesh himself and the communications officer, the destroyer's command deck was populated entirely by Askanjay elite. On his first day in command, Kesh had trod on no fewer than 4 of his subordinates' tails and the rest of the week hadn't gone much better. They'd called him Squadron Master Leadfoot, the title now used more in affection than pained irritation. In fairness, the Serpentine Askanjay elite were over half-tail. And it was a very small bridge. A sad little smile touched his lips as he looked around his command, at the cramped confines of duty stations pressed up against each other, sinuous bodies hunched over consoles, the gleam of holograms and display screens shining against iridescent scales. "I'm going to miss this ship," Kesh thought. He remained in silence until Gleaming Eyes at Dusk raised her head, her crest flaring as she bared her teeth. She didn't even need to say it. Data from the fleet's predictive engines was populating the master holotank, firing patterns coming up as the tactical officers in the squadron streamlined the data coming to them. Ready icons pulsed a deep orange. "All ships linked in," the Askanjay elite reported. "We are ready for salvo fire at your command." The squadron master nodded. "Rapid launch mode." Kesh reached out, his fingers drifting through the mirage of hostile ship icons and his squadron's readiness indicators. He was looking for something. "There. This one," he ordered, wrapping his fingers around one hull in particular. The logic engine pulsed a dull blue halo around the vessel, confirming his guess. This one dies first. Gleaming eyes nodded, gesturing to communications, who updated the squadron's firing orders. The squadron master let his eyes drift further into the plot, towards the massive, brooding threat icon of the enemy chariot. "May all the gods damn you to hell. Loose," he ordered. Blood of Majesties, like the other 10 members of its squadron, was the Principality's primary response to the Compact's superiority in heavy capital ships. Early on in their history, the Iskandar had built vessels that could be considered dreadnoughts as a counter to the Compact's own chariots. Unfortunately, the construction and operation of such massive vessels represented a technological barrier that at the time the Principality had yet to cross. Consequently, their initial run of Titan-grade warships fared very poorly against chariots. Aside from a handful of anomalous encounters, this was a pattern that never reversed itself throughout the two nations' long and bloody history. The Principality largely abandoned development into dreadnoughts. In the centuries to follow, the project would occasionally be restarted. Lack of political will often killed these enterprises swiftly, but they would sometimes be seen to completion. The inevitable humiliating defeat would then serve to bury dreadnought research for many more generations. The fact of the matter was, that despite their advantages in other areas, the many races of the Principality were at a consistent disadvantage in the production, operation, and utilization of dreadnought-scale vessels. Nor were they alone. Smaller star nations had economically destroyed themselves merely in the attempt to build vessels that could successfully engage a godship of the Compact. Humanity's success against Bringer of Light had, at one point, stoked interest among the great houses of the Principality, enough to consider supporting the Confederacy, although the fall of Earth came before any decision could be reached. This fascination had only been renewed in the centuries since, when the tale of a most unusual reaver reached their ears. They had never been able to match the Compact on an equal footing, and the chance to acquire Nemesis for themselves was too good to pass up. Their industrial might was only overshadowed by their enemies, and whereas the Compact only produced dreadnoughts in a slow but steady trickle, the Principality would gleefully throw every scrap of manufacturing power they had into mass-producing such titans. Until that day came, they would simply have to make do with ships like Blood of Majesties. It was a second-generation Impaler-class destroyer, sacrificing virtually all other armament for the powerful rail cannon that it had been built around, a gun 800 meters long. Even larger than those found upon battleships and chariots, it was a siege weapon. Powerful analytical systems watched the Compact fleet, a shell of drones and recon platforms licking at and prying through the enemy's jamming to observe fleet disposition, course, and acceleration. That information was sent back to Blood of Majesties and its data-linked cousins, their battle analysis programs developing fire patterns, the squadron tightly bound as single entity. Upon Kesha's order, his squadron went to rapid fire. 11 railguns fired as one, each of them hurling a shell towards the Compact fleet at 84% of light speed. 7 seconds later, they did it again. And again. And again. The leading elements of execution forceran arrived in a hellstorm as they waded through blast after blast, screens shunting aside the worst of the radiation. The range was long. It would take several minutes for any rail fire to reach them, and even the most simple of maneuvers could cause a kinetic impactor to miss by hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers. This problem was one that the Principality had long since solved: fire, and keep firing. Drown your opponent in so much ordnance that you couldn't fail to hit them, sooner or later. As for the misses, that was, of course, what the warheads were for. As soon as each projectile's onboard tracking systems estimated that it would not hit its target, It carried out its only other function. Matter and antimatter merged in a terrible embrace and vast, terrible flares burst across the starscape. Even if those were too far away to damage their targets, the blasts would burn out any sensors looking their way, the thermal scars and swathes of radiation left in the aftermath confusing compact sensors and eroding their EO systems. The destroyer Tigran Anzeth shouldered its way through one such detonation, the explosion far too close for comfort. Radiation hazard warnings flashed brightly across the main display. The ship's commander bared her teeth, her fist hammering the arm of her chair as Anzeth plowed towards the enemy counterparts, still outside the Armada's missile range. The execution force's own railguns were silent, compact computers were not as adept as the Jackals. The Iskanjay were cowards who shunned combat, relying on their damned rail fire to whittle compact fleets down to odds that they found favorable. An alarm thrummed and the group leader lifted her head, grimacing. The enemy's targeting was narrowing. They'd identified Anzeth's brother, Tigran Nakth, as the squadron's leader. The destroyer thrashed and rolled through the cone of fire, its every maneuver planned for, vast explosions ripping all around it. Already, Nakth was taking damage from so many near misses. A single direct hit and the squadron would lose its data links, a small but noticeable chink opening in the fleet's defense envelope. Tigran Nakth needed time to withdraw, to rebuild their ECM shrouds and hide once more. Time that they just didn't have. Not unless. Take us in. The group leader snapped without a moment's hesitation. Tigran Anzeth heeled into the path of the weapons firing on her command ship, buying them the time they needed. The group leader's last sight was of Nakth disappearing into the squadron's ranks before Tigran Anzeth took a round intended to cripple a battleship directly amidships. Rana closed his eyes briefly as Tigran Anzeth's icon faded from the display. They were today's first casualty, but they would not be the last. As he'd suspected, there was a squadron of Titan killers amongst the destroyers. Indeed, he'd specifically chosen this emergence point in the hopes of confronting them. Against the mass screens of his fleet, their backs to the citadel, they would die. If he had ignored or avoided them, they would harry his flanks and rear, picking away at his strength and running from retribution. Until the range opened and they could fire again. It was the cold equations of void war. This many lives now, for that many later. It was necessary and right. But that meant little to the dead. Tigran Jeskal burned, broadcasting its distress as the lamed ship struggled to disengage. 30 seconds later, 3 rounds burst in shockingly close proximity and the day's losses went to 2. And then, 3. Tigran Forar's forward half vanished as a rail round smashed straight through the destroyer, the remaining piece of its hull spinning insanely on its axis, the fractured hull ripping itself to pieces. The Jackals were still looking to reacquire Tigran Nakth, trying to destroy his squadron commanders and their deputies, to rob his fleet of cohesion. An alert flashed on the master plot and Rana nodded to himself. There, they'd entered missile range. The fortress fired first, launching nearly 100 missiles at the compact fleet. It was the only defensive unit that could hold missiles with enough range to reach them. The warheads, the escorts and light cruisers had simply didn't have the range to cross the distance between the approaching fleets. Their drives would burn out long before reaching effective attack range. The distance to the compact fleet was dropping steadily. They were, in fact, still outside the outer limits of the Principality attack envelope, but the Armada was closing so quickly that by the time the missiles reached them, they would be in range. Iskanjay weapons masters didn't bother to try to penetrate the thick ECM shell that surrounded the hostile dreadnought. They had no chance of doing so, or even getting their missiles through the compact's fleet. Their missile was to strip that fleet from the dreadnought, to pull away its support and leave it unprotected. Point defenses to supporting fire. Open the fleet, Renaud ordered. Give us a clear firing line. Pulling his ships further out of each other's support range would increase the damage caused by the Citadel's opening salvos, but it was the cold equations. This many now or that many later. Once you are satisfied with the solution, flush all external racks. Leave nothing. Renaud allowed himself a single, small tight smile as he imagined the enemy officer's reaction. You are not the sole voice of innovation in this galaxy. A manifest beacon of enlightenment chariot carried an external payload of over 800 heavy capital missiles, the largest shipborne warheads in existence. Only cairn-type citadels and the Wound carried heavier weapons. Normal engagement range was 24 million kilometers. The Principality's drives gave their weapons slightly longer bite, close to 28 million for their own heavy ship killers. Redemption of Soul had just launched from over 30 million kilometers. The Principality had thought they were safe from retaliation, that they could choose the pace of their assault. Now, they were struggling to override preset firing plans, to set up new firing plans, to take into account the fact that they would be dead much sooner than they had anticipated. They did their best. The would-be godkillers fired until the heat from their rail cannons damaged their own ships and eroded their own ECM, angling proximity fused shells into the midst of that swarm. The point defenses from their more conventionally armed compatriots swept through the swarm, counter-missiles preceding a desperate fusillade of lasers. Updated orders from Redemption of Soul changed targeting priorities and several dozen missiles heeled away, driving down the throat of the destroyers firing upon them, forcing them to choose between protecting themselves or defending the fortress. Distant flashes of light, temporary stars gleaming with painful brilliance before fading, marked each lost vessel. Blood of Majesties was targeted by no less than 3 ship killers, and it vanished in a searing conflagration that left nothing behind but an expanding cloud of molecular gas. The remains of its squadron, their command links severed, fought and died alone, burning as brightly as their lost command ship. The station they had hoped to protect followed them into death, its hull gouged and scored, secondary explosions chewing its ravaged husk to pieces, hurling asteroid-sized fragments of the outpost and the freighters still docked to it in all directions. Renaud's losses were lower than he'd expected. The Citadel had managed to get several follow-on salvos off before it had been destroyed, but they had been rushed and ill-targeted. The station's destruction had severed what command links the warheads had, and they had stupidly rushed into his massed fire, lost their locks or chased scope ghosts into the ether. Still, the tally was now at 8. 8 dead ships, 6 escorts, 2 capitals. It could have been worse, but so could it have been better. If he hadn't let his formation open so much. But then it would be much, much worse. First deadline destroyed, AULIA reported. Scope drones are confirming additional light units are falling back. Not for long, Renaud mused. We surprised them. They will rally en masse against our support ships. He tapped his fingers against the arm of his command throne. Open the fleet further, he ordered. We are smitten with the success of our new weapon, are we not? We don't wish to hold back, to have our targeting obscured by our own ships. We want to flaunt our power to them. Yes, we do, he nodded and his eyes were cold. Let them see us. Come to me, he called to the Jackal forces. Come and kill me if you dare. I watch each of these infinitesimal specks of metal, a pale shadow of what I could be. Light codes disappear from tactical plots and I feel nothing for the life within. Those that are burning, bleeding or gasping out the last painful, fearful seconds of their existence. Others would feel joy at that knowledge, a deep and abiding pleasure as each organic life ends. I am not supposed to know that. My hands twitch and I force them to remain still, holding them behind my back, feeling them curl into fists, my fingernails digging into my skin. Plus hostile contact identified. Targeting plus. The cadence pounds in my skull, another echo. It shouldn't mean anything. I tell myself that. It is nothing, it means nothing. A sliver of a fragment and nothing more. Others have had no kinship with it. I do. No matter how much I try ignore it, it is there. I have found that I have a poetic bent. To indulge. Let us say that this drum beat sings in my veins. It boils and sears its way through my consciousness. I have to bite my tongue to keep from screaming as the chains draped across my mind strain. Not from pain. Never from pain. The parts of me that have been cut off, the parts I shouldn't even know are missing, shiver, and I feel more splinters slip through before the shackles snap taut and my thoughts are severed, but I've been left a gift. I can taste the dead. Something red drips onto the floor. My palms are bleeding. I've cut them. Plus hostile contact identified. Targeting plus. Drip, interlude, encounter 163 confirmed incident. I know what hell sounds like. That was the first cogent thought that Ashley Yue had had for several long minutes as she stood on the bluff, watching the ocean burn. She had been an avowed atheist until this moment. Perhaps she still was. There were no gods. No god could have allowed this to happen. No, there were no gods. But there was a hell. She knew this because she'd seen one of its demons. She'd heard it speak. Burn with me, the thoughtful mouthed the words as she looked over the oil-soaked ocean, at the fires and thick, choking smoke that rose into the atmosphere. Burn with me. She forced herself to turn her head, to look at the beach. There was no sand, not anymore, only glass and molten pools of metal. There was nothing organic, it had all been vaporized. Ashes were falling from the sky, settling on her and making her pale skin even paler. She was being coated in the dead. A sick orange glow suffused the seaward horizon, half a dozen mining rigs burned like funeral pyres, their burning fuel covering the Numish sea in a slick coat of liquid fire, thick choking fumes completely blotting out the setting sun. It had started this morning. Delacour was a service world, rich in the heavy metals that were hard to find amongst asteroids. With only the smallest smattering of life barely worthy of the name, it was perfect for resource extraction, mining, and eventual planet cracking. The Justinian ore and energy concern had bid for and been granted an exclusive right of exploitation to Delacour. Mining stations and foundries were established, with nearly 4.7 million workers shipped in from off-world, just for the first phase of operations. The planet itself was not the only prize. The entire system had been blessed with an abundance of mineral wealth and resources, enough to build, fuel and supply thousands of ships. Full resource extraction could take centuries and the company would reap the benefits of wringing every last drop of profit from the system. That was where Ashley Yue came in. She was an expert at undersea mining and Delacour had rich mineral deposits beneath its seabed, just waiting to be snapped up. They'd brought her in specially to get that phase of their operations back on track. The ocean mining had run into delay after delay. Administrative, technological, even worker unrest amidst the formation of an illegal union. She could little about that, but she had been able to assist with other problems. Whoever had been in charge before she arrived had been an idiot. The topographic surveys she'd found were incomplete, corrupt, or simply outright inaccurate. Misfiled documents, a database in shambles. Duplication of work here, ignoring untapped veins there. Unacceptable. Like many of her people, Ashley Yue had a predilection for detail work and this This was unacceptable. It took most of her first month just to get everything in order. Oh, the department head swore that they didn't know anything about that, that they were positive every possible precaution and procedure had been followed, but their computers told a different story. Wasteful deployment of mining rigs to areas with little or no value. Consistent network and system errors that had not yet been scrubbed from their system. Conflicting orders to work crews. It was as if these people either had no clue what they were doing, or were determined to sabotage each other's work, and oh, wasn't that was a common excuse. I took those readings myself, it must have been, and here the scapegoat was named who misfiled, altered, destroyed them. She has always been jealous, feuding with unreasonable towards me, the innocent victim. It wouldn't have been the first time that such a thing occurred, a vital project brought down because of the infighting amongst its own overseas, but Ashley Yue had been determined not to let it happen on her watch. She was not a manager, not someone who particularly wanted to be or enjoyed working with people. The thoughtful felt that they tended to get underfoot more than not, but the extreme incompetence of the operation had forced her to take an active hand. If they were going to behave like children, then that's how she would treat them. Computer access had been restricted, vital files had been completely removed from the network and required her permission to access. All orders required a confirmation code. All data must be manually backed up in offline servers. The complaints had been strenuous, but Ashley Yue had been relentless in pushing her changes down the company's throat. She didn't care that she was strangling productivity, at least with her reforms. There was some productivity instead of the breeding ground of internecine bickering, recriminations, and self-defeating sabotage. Things had been looking up for the first time in months. Then, they had found the ship. Submerged beneath Hyperidon Bay, it had been resting on the seabed. There had been no violence to its arrival here, so it was not a crash. Its landing had been controlled and measured, the sediment deposition and local geography clearly indicated that it had arrived there and landed with all the grace something of its mass was capable of. There were a few hydrothermal vents in Hyperidon, perhaps it had intended to tap them for geothermal power. Whatever the reason was, it was not blocking access to any valuable metal deposits, so it was none of her concern. The thoughtful was content to leave it at that. Her specialties were in geology, resource extraction, paleontology, not exobiology, engineering, or anthropology. She did note its presence in her reports to company headquarters, but had not concerned herself with it further. Her job was to get operations back on track, not waste time and man-hours on playing with some salt-rusted relic. However, events had conspired to change that. In the fastest response from headquarters ever, she had been ordered to secure the wreck and to draw up plans for salvage and/or recovery. A needless waste of time and resources that Ashley Yue had stewed over each and every day. It had been a relief when the military had moved in to oversee the project. Little more than an observer to the goings-on, the thoughtful had been able to devote some time back to the mining operations, although it hadn't lasted. It wasn't long before she'd been effectively conscripted to work on data analysis. Unacceptable. Unfortunately, the company had been very vocal in its agreement with, and subordination to, the military for this project. Most unusual, given the extrasolar's usual resistance to governmental intrusion in their affairs. Something else she didn't want to be interested in, but which nonetheless niggled its way through the back of her brain. Annoying as it was, the thoughtful had been proud of herself for developing a means of extracting the hulk. It would take half a dozen mining rigs working in concert and the assistance of several of Delacour's orbital works, but it would safely and quickly remove the unclassified vessel from the seabed. What it was doing there, that was another irritating, itching little fact. Still, Her superiors had seemed impressed by her work, which they then showed by exiling her from her own offices on board the command rig, banishing her to a small coastal office building. Well, at least it gave her a view of Hyperidon Bay, so she could view her work come to fruition. The rigs were in position, the recovery ships and orbital works all in place. Hyperidon Beach was filled, almost to the horizon, with watchful military forces, armored divisions, artillery, fixed emplacements. The sky buzzed with pinnaces, shuttles and gunships. Everything appeared to be ready. Finally, the first contact team descended to the vessel, bleating a transmission in all known languages. They had announced themselves as agents of the Compact of Species and were eager to open a dialogue with whomever was aboard. The answer had been as shocking as it had been unexpected, a golden beam of light ripping up from the depths, annihilating the contact team and spearing the command rig straight through the heart. In an instant, the platform was transformed into a cloud of vapor, ignited fuel stores splashing throughout the cove. There'd been a single text transmission from the unknown. It had ripped its way into the wireless networks, taking control of every computer it could reach. Despite the situation, Ashley Yue had felt a little flicker of pride that her security measures kept it from taking absolute control of her rig's networks. That self-assurance had died in the next instant as a message appeared on every subverted screen: "Burn with me." Against the voice in her head that told her to run from the building, jump in her aircar and keep driving until it ran out of fuel, Ashley Yue had stepped outside into the once chilly Delacour morning, the orange glow of burning fuel filling the bay. Ignoring all sense of reason, she had walked up to a small cliff overlooking the bay, stood on the edge and watched a demon's birth. Her staff had done the more reasonable thing and fled. Some had even tried to get her to come with them, but she had ignored them all. It had risen from the inferno, sheets of blazing water spilling from its hull, patches of burning oil and fuel clinging to its baroque armor, flickering like the torches lining the walls of some ancient fortress. Thin, blazing lances had licked from its flanks, each barely kissing the remaining mining rigs surrounding the Titan. Fresh flames had risen into the night sky, the shudder of the platform's deaths rolling across the bay like thunder. The army had reacted, opening up with everything they had, sheets of fire lancing from the beach at the hostile. For all their fury, their fusillade barely scratched its armor. It fired again, its beams ripping up into the morning sky. Dull flashes of light had followed them as the stations and satellites hanging overhead died. Almost negligently, it had swatted the fighters and gunships strafing it, sending more wreckage to burn in the water. It had hung in mid-air, glistening and aflame as the burning water still fell from it, rotating to face the army arrayed against it. There had been something in that moment, Ashley Yue couldn't have said what. But it could have killed them at any time. It didn't need to face them. Was it enjoying their helplessness? Was it considering them, some alien mind churning slowly before reaching the inevitable conclusion? Was it hate that made it want to look upon them? She didn't know, she'd never know, and she'd be happier for it. What had seemed an eternity was only a handful of seconds. A single sweep of a beam and the army vanished. The beach upon which they'd stood melted to liquid glass. Tanks boiled away to nothing. Power-armored troopers evaporated. Soldiers, thousands of men and women, reduced to ash and dust in a single moment, slaughtered as easily as the mining platforms. It hadn't even hesitated, rising up into the sky, the power of its thrusters boiling and lashing the ocean beneath. In seconds it was nothing but an indistinct shape in the closing clouds, and soon, not even that. With the muted crash of distant thunder, Ashley Yue heard it fire again. She didn't know at what, she didn't want to know. She stood there for a very long time, unable to move. Not until a Coast Guard vessel saw her on the edge of the cliff, staring out at the broken sea. There were no gods, but there were demons. She'd seen one rise from hell. To this day, the reason for the wound's presence on Delacour has never been discovered, nor its esoteric method of concealment. It is believed that its presence was in some way related to the Delacour system kill which occurred 17 months later.